This is a content warning, as this video covers depictions of heavy material concerning mental disorders and trauma. Viewers' discretion is advised, and spoiler alert for all of Moon Knight. So, one of the best things to come out of Disney Plus, in my opinion, has been Moon Knight. Less a superhero flick and more of a psychological thriller, it nonetheless played wonderfully on the lines that walk between the two genres, while including relevant elements of psychology and divinity. It's the former of those two that really stuck with me. As the series continued on, I legitimately wondered what was real and what was not. Between the constant shifts in scenery, the vagueness of most of the characters, and the unreliability of its main character, it was a story like no other with quite open-ended narratives. I found myself questioning what was real by the end of the last episode. What threads were true and what were not? Possibly some of my favorite moments came nearing the end. Not the end of the story, but the end of Moon Knight's actual background. After hint, the series finally shifted focus to the story of Mark Spector, the man behind the mask. Or should I say, the men behind the mask. Although I want to first start off by noting that psychology can be a sensitive topic. It should be talked about when appropriate, of course, and obviously we should all strive to understand the scale of mental health. So I want to put out a disclaimer that I wrote this to the best of what I have learned and my personal observations while watching Moon Knight. This is not entirely a deep dive or psychoanalysis as much as it is a summary, a study of both narrative and psychological elements involved in the slow burner that is Marvel's Moon Knight. It is also a collection of my thoughts and my feelings. And I do want to put it out there that this Moon Knight does dramatize some aspects of the psychology involved to add a narrative flair. With that said, this is what I learned while watching Moon Knight. Trailers and comic books will inform you that Moon Knight has a case of DID, Dissociative Identity Disorder. What is DID? According to the Mayo Clinic, DID is characterized by switching to alternate identities. Someone may feel the presence of two or more people talking or living inside their head, and they may feel as though they're possessed by other identities. Each identity may have a unique name, personal history, and characteristics, including obvious differences in voice, gender, mannerisms, and even such physical qualities as the need for eyeglasses. There also are differences in how familiar each identity is with the others. People with dissociative identity disorder typically also have dissociative amnesia and often have dissociative fugue. The National Health Service notes that dissociative identity disorder used to be called multiple personality disorder. Someone diagnosed with DID may feel uncertain about their identity and who they are. The main symptoms of DID are memory gaps about everyday events and personal information, and having several distinct identities, among other related symptoms tied to other points of mental health. Mark Spector has DID. There are two other identities that the body of Mark Spector houses. One is Stephen Grant, a knowledgeable, introverted dork who is kindly, if not clumsy socially and physically, complete with a geeky British accent.
Did you do that?
The other is Jake Longley, who is essentially a psychopath who delights in killing.
Hoy te toca perder.
In the show, these identities all experience things differently, but endure symptoms and psychological blocks. Because these identities are fragments of one identity, they act on their own traits, while being seemingly incapable of actions or instincts that the others possess.
So have I. It's the same body, isn't it? It's in there somewhere. Muscle memory and that. Yeah, I'm not sure it works that way.
In Moon Knight, typically Stephen will outsmart his way out of a problem, while Mark will likely fight his way out of a problem. In spite of sharing the same body and same brain, one cannot function like the other can, a unique problem that sets the tone for their relationship. This is to show the exact differences that distinguish Mark and Stephen's characters.
Now give me the body.
This is especially prevalent when Stephen is put in dangerous situations that Mark would normally brush off, or when Mark is confronted with a puzzle that only Stephen can understand. On top of that, amnesiac symptoms only make things trickier, as there are times that one identity or the other can't remember what the other did to or for them. These fugue states are sort of like when you're watching a video and there's a cutout just in the middle of it, but you can still hear the audio. Something clearly happened but was forgotten because of the fugue state. So, where did all this begin? Well, let's take a trip to the asylum.
Be nice to your little brother.
Like all young dreamers, Mark Spector was idealistic and innocent. He had a family, and he had things that he liked. Something like adventure. Enthusiastic as he may have been about adventure, about emulating adventurers like Stephen Grant, this childlike innocence led to the passing of his brother Randall during one of their adventures. The passing of Randall cast a dark shadow over the Spector family. The younger Mark took the blame and the vengefulness of his mother, who eventually turned into a grieving alcoholic. This tension in the family was never resolved. It led to Mark abandoning his family, including his father, who tried all he could to show love to his distraught son. But that's not everything. It was around the time that Mark was in the military that he had fugue states.
Turns out going AWOL in a fugue state gets you discharged from the military. Didn't have a ton of options after that, so I went work for hire for my old CO Bushman.
There's a lot of stuff about fugue states floating around, but in essence, it leaves the person amnesiac, like a blackout, but worse, caused by things such as abuse and war. It was with this unpredictable psychological side effect that Mark, dying from his wounds as a mercenary, was visited and then claimed by Khonshu, the vengeful god of the moon.
As my fist of vengeance, as my Moon Knight.
Let me add in here that Mark is not mindless. He knows Khonshu is puppeteering him, like the breath of a monster at the back of the neck. But at the same time, he doesn't have much to hope for. Yes, he has a wife, Layla, who supports him and is a trustworthy partner. But does she know that Mark had indirectly led a mercenary officer to destroy her father? Actually, what is truth at this point for Mr. Spector? Egyptian gods are real, and he's a mummified vigilante fighter who pursues and destroys those who would prey on the travelers of the night. Oh, and sometimes he wakes up and doesn't know what happens. He sees himself in mirrors when he's not in control of his own body, and said body, under the influence of Stephen, acts nothing like Mark. It doesn't help that Mark keeps having visions of a psych ward, complete with medical servants and a doctor. The same doctor who reflects back to Mark what he's been experiencing throughout the series. With the way these scenes transition between memories and the present, it adds more complexity and confusion to the broken psyche of Mark.
Your brain is a pendulum swinging between a very difficult reality that you are my patient here at Putnam Medical Facility in Chicago, Illinois, and a reassuring fantasy that you've created on your own, that you're some kind of, I don't know, superhero.
Personally, I think that while the Egyptian world of myth, where all of the action had been taking place, would be a good way to symbolize all of Mark's hatred and thirst for adventure, the psych ward with the doctor and the nurses, this could be the way that Mark tries to organize and rationalize his supernatural story and Stephen. This blank state that reacts and tries to reassure him could be how Mark gains some sense of stability and suppression to push away the trauma of his past and put his Moon Knight career in a recycling bin of make-believe. Hey, future me here. So Mark is not actually having these visions regularly, but rather he's in a near-death experience when this happened. This is an error I noticed post-writing, but it is still a good turning point for Mark to begin reconciling with Stephen. My point stands that it is likely an organizing principle to rationalize all of Mark's drama and conflict. Anyways, back to the video. Stephen has been here too. He is Mark and Mark is him after all. So, at this point, who is Stephen? Is it Stephen Grant? But Stephen Grant is just an action figure. So why do I keep mentioning him? Well, the reality is that Mark's fear of a mother he no longer knew is what developed Stephen, a gentle, innocent soul that is neat and tidy and knows nothing that Mark does. A soul created by someone he emulated, Stephen Grant, who never fears when danger is near. But fear is not something you can just turn on and off like a light switch. Like all emotions, they fluctuate inside of us, and it's up to us to act on them or act on something else in their stead. For example, choosing courage over fear. That said, Stephen is a separate identity, an insulation that remained ignorant of pain and suffering. Truth to either persona is enabled only when one is in control of the body they inhabit. So imagine Steven's own emotional whiplash when he realizes that his mother has died, the same mother that he'd been calling and having happy conversations with all his life. It was during the Shiva, the funeral, that Mark and Steven's separate psyches began to mesh together, when the macho man and the little kid finally came to an understanding for themselves. Each of them, they've lost their family. Their worlds were created on guilt and lies. Now with a death cult causing Armageddon on a divine scale, they might lose the life they each had built for themselves. But because of their unresolved trauma literally dividing their lives in two, being Moon Knight isn't gonna be easy. Two identities, one body, many memories. But let's focus on the one. The human body is a complex organism with multitudes of physical features, quirks, and many other things that help complete its structure. In Moon Knight's depiction of Mark and Steven, we have two different lives, not just one mindset to another, and their personal makeups contrast each other in many ways. Mark is tidy, Steven is not. Steven's apparently British.
I'm not the fist of anything. That's the little American man living inside of me.
While Mark is American.
The ceremonial armor from Conchu's temple, not Psycho Colonel Sanders.
These seem like normal things to consider in the scope of a superhero flick, but consider all the effects that contribute to even just the most shallow personality traits of Mark and Steven, cultural, intellectual, etc. Look at a scene here. These followers of Amit are terrified of Amit's staff. It's likely taught to them that it is dangerous, while also learning of their god's fearsome power and attitude towards life and death.
Why do this dance for the rest of time?
You know the answer. I only punish those who have chosen evil.
So do I. Only I don't give them the satisfaction of committing it.
Such knowledge and experience leads to an immediate and intimate response that triggers their reverence or perhaps fear. And then there comes the issue of choice. And when it comes to choice, Steven was not given much of a choice when Mark's moon knighting, no pun intended, caught up to him. And although he's not ideal for combat, his intelligence is extremely useful. He's not conditioned to fight until the final parts of the series. His range of choices are centered around safety, intellectual perseverance, and passivity. Mark is about your typical vigilante superheroism, diving into danger using practical strategies involving equipment and personal skills. These are two different methodologies, operating separately while bound in one Moon Knight. More than anything though, both were on their own. Neither Steven nor Mark could exactly trust anyone, not even themselves. What about Layla? Well, living the kind of life Moon Knight does, even for a spouse, is not a fantastic relationship builder. Add to it the effects of an identity disorder, and, well, I think we know where this leads to. Different perceptions, different truths have shaped the identities of these two individual psyches, each having created their own realities in which they act and look upon the world. And they each had their own problems because of their unique perceptions of the world.
You're not gonna die. Let me save us.
I find it intriguing that Arthur Harrow, a former Moon Knight,
Not anymore. I was his former avatar.
has chosen to side with Amit, a divine being whose goal is to erase evil entirely. How it's done is by doling out judgment to people before evil could be committed.
This is the face of a good man.
Call it theory, but I think that with such language that Arthur uses, such as
Cruel masses.
that there is some semblance of someone who would rather not have a world filled with pain, a world that would torment people like Steven. Perhaps it's coincidence or symbolic conflict, but remember that Mark created Steven to cope with the trauma of his broken family and the abuse he suffered for years from youth to young adulthood. He did not eradicate evil, but rather unconsciously formed a way to endure injustice. And though Steven is a bumbling fool at times, he's also aware of the error of Amit's judgment.
Sorry, if Amit judges people pre-evil, like before the fact, then isn't she judging an innocent person?
Which is, in essence, the death of an innocent as a preventative measure to a potential choice. As I watched Moon Knight and then rewatched it again, I thought about what I've seen and felt over the course of Khonshu and Amit's war and the people caught in between, because if you really take a step back, that's essentially what is happening. Two mighty beings controlling people far less powerful than them to do their bidding. Regardless of motives, the issue of control is the underlying theme that plays a part in every scene. So, how does this affect our fragmented vigilante? Consider the two personas. For Mark Spector, Steven is but a fragment of control that he has in a world that decides too often for him. Trauma has nurtured in him a survivor. Control has never been in his hands, and when he's even had an ounce of it, he's used it rather recklessly, joining the army, drinking his sorrows away. It's a window to the instability of his soul as a result of his trauma. And, with all of the knowledge he has about Steven and his Moon Knight curse, he keeps trying to move forward with his life without finding resolution with his past trauma.
So what? What does it matter? What, you want to remember the truth? That you had a mother that beat you? That hated you? That made your life a living hell?
In avoiding the pain of past abuses,
The house, there was that bedroom that you didn't want me to go into. That's it, that's what we should
Just a
do.
second, just wait a second. Just give me a second here, okay? Look, we don't have to go back through it all again. We can just talk. Let's just talk right here, right now. I'll tell you everything, okay? I'm just begging you, don't make us go there again. It's not worth it.
he's actually digging deeper and deeper into a void that has been created in his heart, the product of grief and the absence of peace. Stephen Grant, on the other hand, is a person with a react-first mentality. He peeks into a world he was not meant to dwell in, experiences supernatural violence as a result of a history that is not his, and generally needs a reason that appeals to him in order to take control. He's a person that keeps to himself, but the split life of Moon Knight demands that he step out of his comfort zone in order to save the world. For both, as much as they would want the other to just be an imagination that they can rationalize based on their guilt or some far-off, emotionally blank fantasy like a psychiatric clinic, the reality is that the torment that Mark suffered so thoroughly broke a mind in twain, separating idealisms and dreams from the heart that carried pain on its metaphorical shoulders. Far beyond his divine patron and even his split identities, Mark needed to accept the whole of himself, pains, weaknesses, and all. Every aspect that made up his broken psyche he'd been pushing away, as he had with his broken family. It was time to accept it for what it was, to understand that it is not his fault, and to make peace with his family, not for their sake, but for his and Stephen's. Rightly so, he finally acknowledged that Stephen is not simply just a failsafe, but a part of him, not just a psychic projection of a life without trauma, but a critical part of his own life that could hope and believe in better things to come. He needed to embrace his past and present for what it was, broken, and begin to slowly let it go and find new meaning to his sorrows and his afflicted mind. And thankfully, Stephen was there for him all this time.
I survived because I knew I wasn't alone.
When you look in the mirror, what do you see? Do you see your doubts, your fears, your weaknesses? Or do you see your strengths, your physique, your unique makeup and personality? Are you being honest with yourself, regardless of your strengths or weaknesses? This is not to say that we all have another identity that sits in the back of our heads, threatening to take over on claims of it knowing better. But I'm sure that we all have thoughts and feelings that we might project onto ourselves. Some we don't want, others we might wish for. I want to move away from the identity disorder parts of DID and focus on the dissociative part for a hot minute here, as I learned much about this aspect the most while writing this script. It was around the time that I was writing the script that there were large wildfires that created smog that choked entire communities, mine included. It was during one of those irritable evenings that a thunderstorm rolled around. There is an ominous relief that I unconsciously associate with thunderstorms. It's a prompting for me to get some sleep or to find silence in the storm. This time around, it was a more positive relief, a light at the end of the dark tunnel type of relief. The National Health Services notes, dissociation is a way the mind copes with too much stress. Now, I don't want to say that the anxiety and irrationality caused by wildfire smog is equal to the story of Mark Spector, but the first day after the fog lifted, I was overjoyed and took in the blue sky, the white clouds, the vibrant summer colors, and cool, unfiltered breeze. This kind of environment helped to mellow out my own stresses while enjoying the beauty of nature in the moment. That does not mean that all my negative feelings went away or that they were permanently cured. In fact, a lot of my stress was unrelated to either the storm or the smog, but it was easier to dwell on good things like a cool summer day when they returned after being taken away. It's understanding that emotions don't turn on and off like a light switch, and that we can choose how and why we act regardless of the circumstances we find ourselves in. How does this relate to Mark and Steven? Psychology Today brings up regulation. Regulation occurs when an individual experiencing chronic trauma has thoughts and feelings they are unable to understand but still must manage to cope. Stephen Grant serves as a friend and support system for Mark, as well as providing a model for what good behaviors look like when attempting to engage in the world. After coming to terms with the coexistence of one another, they realized that they didn't need to fight each other to prove the value of their existence. They didn't need to project their insecurities and fears onto the other. Even if the mistakes of, say, Steven somehow crept up and affected Mark, they didn't need to accuse one and the other for something they didn't do and would not do. It's inconvenient to have to deal with the consequences. It rarely is convenient, period. But more than consequences, they needed to accept themselves as individuals for who they were and what they can do, and work in tandem with the other to get themselves in a better place, preferably outside of Khonshu's dirty laundry, as the moon god was more or less setting a standard for anxiety and stress with all of his plots and plans. There's a process called integration for those diagnosed with DID. The gist of it is, according to website DID Research, is when an individual incorporates a fact into their understanding of their self or an event into their understanding of their personal history. That's integration. It also goes on to note that every individual who has been through trauma must integrate to some extent as part of healing. That means accepting that the trauma occurred, making it part of one's personal narrative, and making it accessible in a way that does not cause intense re-experiencing of trauma elements. In doing so, an individual may have to accept thoughts, feelings, and urges associated with their trauma. In more formal words, this is an example of how Mark and Steven were able to come together. I'm not saying that we all have the same psyche, the same mental and emotional problems as one another, but think of it like this. Every feeling, every thought has a purpose. Example, fear keeps us away from dangerous places, but fear can also keep us from achieving our goals, even if that goal is overcoming our fear. It's one thing to be reasonably afraid of something that hurts us. That's normal. It's another thing to allow fear or anger or any other imbalanced emotion or thought to start shaping not just our lives, but the way we see and live our lives. Basically, allowing these things to form a nature separate from but connected to our own. A peculiar nature that gnaws away at the back of our heads, born from doubt, avoidance, laziness, etc. A nature that moves away from the things we value. It's often called the carnal nature or the natural man in theology. Where does Moon Knight fall in this? Well, both Mark and Steven refused to work with each other, falling back within their comfort zone, even if it hurt the other. Both have been shown to try to think things away, which leads back to the psych ward. Their peculiar natures each have their own individual merit, given the circumstances and stakes involved, but they both come with downsides, usually at the cost of the other. This falls within the range of negatives associated with these dissociative symptoms. Dissociation without temperance can lead to an imbalance and its own set of problems, regardless of the reason. Why else would the unique identities of Steven and Mark want to fight each other, in spite of all of the problems and pain they keep bumping into? Understanding and accepting pain is but a step towards healing, and the more we learn and grow from, the more prepared we can become to embrace pain or stress, to name a couple, for what it is, and most importantly, not allow it to tear apart our lives and reshape our identities. What are the things inside of ourselves that could prevent us from taking even the tiniest steps forward? Is it knowing the truth?
All this time I thought I was the original.
Is it being out of our depth?
You look scared.
No. Well, you should be.
Is it questioning the motives of a god?
Well, isn't that a bit dodgy, like trusting the judgment of a weird crocodile lady?
Actually, what is the focus of our lives? It could be said that neither Stephen nor Mark were focused on anything beyond Khonshu's wishes. This fortunately paved the way for their afterlife experience and the sequential search of the memories that would unite both identities.
What the hell's wrong with you? Well, I did a whole little speech there. It wasn't that little.
Similar to what I talked about in the Samurai Jack video, our own worst enemy is often ourselves. Moon Knight takes this and puts it in the narrative realm of the negative for a few episodes, with Mark and Steven at odds with each other constantly for control over the body. And here we see many of the questions and lack of knowledge, primarily from Steven's side, that prevents him and Mark from fully reconciling their joint existence, even as Mark consciously refuses to share with Steven, the identity he had unconsciously created, the complete story of his tormented mind.
You've got to live a happy, simple, normal life. You understand? But it was all a lie, wasn't it? So what?
There's a few things to keep in mind. DID, as represented at the forefront of the show, has differences from what the Moon Knight story displayed. In an article about DID and what Moon Knight accurately and inaccurately points out, Kelly Caniglia, a member of the board of the nonprofit DID advocacy organization An Infinite Mind, notes that the creation of identities is not a conscious choice, such as when Mark created Steven on a whim. On that note, Steven being unaware of Mark is also inaccurate. In fact, it would be the opposite, as he would not only know about Mark's traumatic past, but also his family and his wife. As for Mark, he would have less knowledge of his actual childhood, as Steven would be the one to remember and thus safeguard him from the abuse and the suffering that he had endured during that time. Dr. Robert T. Mueller, author of Trauma and the Struggle to Open Up, notes that a person with DID may have personalities that are aware of one another and others that are not. Caniglia observes that it's more common for alters to be aware of the host personality, while the host personality has no idea there are alters. Consequently, a more realistic scenario would be that Steven would be aware of Mark, but Mark wouldn't be aware of Steven. That said, everyone with DID has a slightly different experience, so Mark's awareness of Steven isn't necessarily wrong, it's just unlikely. Remember that these things were likely done for narrative purposes and to provide a window into DID when it comes to mental health awareness. Another thing that might give a hazardous impression of DID is the existence of Jake, the ultra-violent identity. Violence and mental health already have a strained relationship in the media. According to Dr. Mueller, if they're a danger to anybody, they can be a danger to themselves, and that's because of the trauma history. Story-wise, this is represented by the constant shifts between the identities in the third episode, The Friendly Type, where Mark and Steven alternate between going for fatalistic attacks and sparing their opponents up until they're both knocked out, awakening to find themselves having butchered their enemies, the mark of Jake. And though it may seem like it technically makes sense that Mark created Jake as a way to enact the hatred and wrath that his mother had nurtured in him because of her abuse, recall that creating identities is not a purposeful choice and that identities are developed to protect the diagnosed. It does make sense for Steven to be so seemingly wise and sage-like when comforting Mark about his past guilt, as this existential crisis of identity is what made him a hard-hearted survivor. For Steven to be unaware of even Mark's Moon Knight career is meant for dramatic purposes, technically making sense to Steven's innocent character, but inaccurate according to medical research. And perhaps the last thing to point out is that, according to DID research, dissociative identity disorder is often covert and difficult to notice, with only 5 to 6% of individuals with DID having a more florid presentation. Switching between alters is rarely accompanied by dramatic shifts in personality that are highlighted by changes in clothing, preferences, and accent. In contrast, systems often go to great lengths to hide their condition and will deny and downplay their symptoms as much as possible once diagnosed. Alters frequently manifest through passive influence instead of completely taking executive control. And many individuals with DID are amnesiac for their own amnesia and do not notice even when a full switch has occurred. So, presentation, such as Stephen being a British dork and Jake being an unhinged Spaniard, is a narrative liberty, but it does help communicate the meaning behind their existence and the length to which Mark needed to reconcile with his past and embrace his tormented history. These are just a few things to clarify. There will be some articles I'll put down in the description talking about the full list of accuracies and inaccuracies of Moon Knight's depiction of DID, but let's remember that they were also creating a story that can flow with all elements involved, even if there are some liberties taken because of it.
We'd rather go save the world. Later, skaters.
So, there it is. What I learned from Disney Plus's Moon Knight. I hope that you were able to learn something about DID, dissociation, etc., and that what I have shared made some measure of sense to you. I conclude with this. It is always a good feeling for us when we find mediums in which we can discover a sense of connection to our personal strengths and weaknesses and the things we just can't seem to get a grasp on, including our own mental health. If you want to continue learning about DID, there will be the links to the sources that I've cited in the description down below. Thank you once again for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, all that good jazz. And as always, no worries, happy to help.